They say empires are not destroyed by armies, but by the secrets festering inside their palaces. In the marble corridors of Byzantium, where mosaics glittered like jewels and incense clung heavy in the air, a far darker truth hid beneath the silken veils of ceremony. Behind closed doors, in chambers guarded by silence and shadows, emperors and empresses indulged in rituals so grotesque, so perverse, that even Rome's darkest decadence seemed tame. But what happens when these forbidden pleasures do more than corrupt a dynasty? What happens when they give birth to one of the most dangerous women history has ever known? A woman who rose from obscurity, bathed in humiliation, and ascended. The throne armed not just with power, but with the secrets of men's darkest desires. This is not the story of an ordinary ruler. This is the tale of how the Byzantine Empire's most horrifying sexual practices shaped the destiny of an empress who would become both feared and untouchable. Her rise was not written in glory, but in scandal, and the cost was an empire that would never recover. So ask yourself, if the heart of an empire beats not with justice or faith, but with lust and cruelty, can its walls of gold truly keep out the collapse that follows? From the outside, Constantinople looked like a dream carved in stone. Its walls, 3 layers deep, rose like a fortress of eternity. Its gilded domes caught the morning sun, blazing with a light so brilliant that sailors swore they could see the city's glow from miles across the sea. Markets overflowed with silks from China, spices from Arabia, jewels from India. The empire's chroniclers called it the New Rome, the heir to Caesar's glory. To the world beyond, Byzantium was untouchable, but illusions are always brightest, just before they break. Behind the glitter of mosaics and the solemn chants of church choirs, Byzantium hid a reality far darker than its golden facades. Every street whispered contradictions, priests preaching purity while consorting in secret with courtesans, generals swearing loyalty while plotting betrayal, and emperors kneeling before icons, only to plunge into depravity when the doors closed. The empire sold itself as the guardian of faith, yet its throne was often purchased with lust, scandal, and blood. The Byzantines were masters of spectacle. Power was theatre, and every procession, every coronation, every ritual was designed to overwhelm the senses. The emperor sat not as a man, but as a god on earth, draped in robes stitched with pearls, seated on a throne that seemed to float above the floor. Courtiers trembled before him as mechanical lions roared and golden birds sang from jeweled trees. But what mattered most was not the glory, it was the illusion, because beneath this theatre of power, the empire was slowly devouring itself. In taverns and private salons, the city's true appetites surfaced. Aristocrats, bored of piety, indulged in excess that made Roman decadence look like a child's game. Orgies, rituals, and humiliations became not only entertainment, but instruments of control. To be degraded in the Byzantine court was sometimes worse than being killed, for the spectacle of shame fed both gossip and power. Those who survived humiliation often became pawns in larger games, forever marked, forever scarred. This obsession with spectacle extended to cruelty. Chariot races in the hippodrome were not just sport, but riots waiting to happen, where factions cheered and bled for dominance. The same people who prayed for salvation would scream for blood when a rival faction fell. Even justice was a performance. Executions staged with precision. Punishments carried out to entertain the masses. To live in Byzantium was to live inside a theatre, and everyone, willingly or not, was an actor. Yet this theatre had another side. Beneath the marble halls, in the shadows of the city, life was brutal. The poor lived in narrow alleys where sewage ran in the streets and disease thrived. Foreigners, slaves, and women were despised by elites, treated as bodies to be used, mocked, and discarded. The racial and cultural hierarchy of the empire was unrelenting. To be born outside the favored class was to be invisible until one was, needed as an object of ridicule or desire. Byzantium's cruelty was not random. It was ritualized, systematized, and masked as tradition. It was in this world of contradictions, of shining gold and rotting foundations, of prayers spoken with mouths that dripped with sin, that the story of the most dangerous empress began. She was not born into splendor. She did not walk the palace halls as a child. She grew up among shadows, her earliest memories shaped not by mosaics and liturgies, but by the laughter of men who mocked the weak and by the cruel entertainments of an empire that turned humiliation into art. To understand her rise, one must first understand Byzantium itself. This was not a land where morality ruled. It was a land where survival demanded performance. Where to play the game, one had to accept the rules, that shame could be weaponized, that scandal could elevate, and that nothing was sacred if it meant keeping hold of power. And within this theater of illusions, a girl was about to step onto the stage, a girl whose scars would become her armor, and whose knowledge of the empire's darkest appetites would make her not just a survivor, but a weapon. If Constantinople was a city of gold, she was born in its gutters. Her childhood was not framed by mosaics of saints or the chants of priests, but by the stench of fish markets, the damp of alley walls, and the jeers of men who tossed coins not as charity, but as insults. She entered the world not as a daughter of nobility, but as a child marked by shame. Her father was little more than a name. Some whispered he had been a bearkeeper in the hippodrome, others that he had abandoned his family in disgrace. Her mother, left with nothing, struggled to keep the children alive, and when that became impossible, she did what thousands of desperate women did in Byzantium. She pushed her daughter into the only trade that never lacked customers, the trade of the body. The girl was still young when she first learned the cruelty of men. What Byzantium called entertainment was, for her, a daily humiliation. In taverns thick with wine fumes, she was mocked, paraded, forced to dance while laughter tore her dignity apart. To the aristocrats who attended such spectacles, she was nothing more than a joke in human form, a disposable actor in their endless theater of cruelty. But she was watching, always watching. Humiliation became her first education. She saw how men in power revealed their secrets when drunk, how their weaknesses emerged when they thought no one noticed. She learned that those who sneered at her were often the same who begged in private for her touch. And slowly, she began to understand a terrible truth. In Byzantium, shame could be turned into power, if one knew how to wield it. The girl's childhood was also a lesson in prejudice. She was mocked not only for her poverty, but for her blood. Her family carried traces of foreign lineage, and in a city obsessed with purity of class and origin, this was unforgivable. Half-breed, they whispered, unworthy. Byzantium was an empire built on the backs of countless peoples, Armenians, Slavs, Syrians, Africans. Yet it despised those who carried mixed heritage. To be of the margins was to be treated as dirt, to be branded unfit for respect. And so she grew up in shadows, despised by men, sneered at by women, degraded for survival. But within her humiliation, something was forming. A resolve sharper than the jeweled daggers of the palace guards. One story, whispered long after her. Death claimed that as a child she was forced to participate in one of the empire's grotesque entertainments. Aristocrats demanded not only performances of dance and mockery, but degrading acts designed to strip dignity from the performer. She endured what would break most, yet even in that moment, she never forgot the faces that laughed. Years later, when she stood in power, she would remember them, and she would make Byzantium remember too. By her teenage years, she had traveled with troops of performers, serving as both dancer and courtesan. The stage was humiliation, but it also gave her a strange kind of education. She saw the courts of governors, the lavish banquets of generals, the private rituals of priests. She saw hypocrisy everywhere. Bishops who denounced sin in the daylight but gorged themselves on flesh at night. Generals who spoke of loyalty yet sold secrets to enemies. Each performance exposed her to another layer of Byzantium's rot. Yet, what could have destroyed her spirit instead hardened it. Each insult became a lesson. Each humiliation became a mask she learned to wear. By the time she was barely grown, she had become a master of performance. Not the kind that drew laughter, but the kind that hid her true self behind a veil of submission. Her enemies believed they were breaking her. In reality, they were training her, for in the empire of illusions, only those who understood masks could ever hope to survive. And soon, the girl who had been mocked as a shadow would step into the firelight of scandal, not as a victim, but as a player in Byzantium's most dangerous game. Byzantium loved nothing more than a scandal. It fed the empire's appetite for spectacle in ways that sermons and ceremonies never could. Rumors spread faster than plague, whispered in taverns, shouted in the hippodrome, woven into sermons by priests eager to condemn. And no figure fed that hunger more than the girl who had once been invisible. By her late teens, she had already become infamous. Aristocrats retold stories of her performances with a mix of fascination and disgust. She was mocked in plays, satirized in pamphlets, and derided by bishops from their pulpits. Yet even as they condemned her, they could not look away. Every new rumor, every tale of degradation, only etched her name deeper into the empire's consciousness. Her enemies thought they were destroying her reputation. In truth, they were building it. In Byzantium, scandal was a double-edged sword. For the weak, it meant ruin. For the cunning, it could be transformed into a weapon more potent than armies. She understood this better than anyone. Where others would bow their heads in shame, she leaned into infamy, using it to keep herself unforgettable. Men desired her, women feared her, priests cursed her, and all unknowingly gave her the one thing most precious in Byzantium: visibility. Her survival became a study in strategy. She never fought her reputation, she manipulated it. When mocked for her shamelessness, she laughed louder than her enemies. When priests condemned her, she turned their words into proof of her notoriety. She wove scandal into armor, until even those who despised her admitted she possessed something dangerous: the power to command attention. And attention was the currency of empire. Still, notoriety alone was not enough. She needed to step beyond the taverns and alleys, into the very heart of power: the palace. The court was a place where beauty and scandal could open doors faster than loyalty or birthright. And so she set her eyes on those who mattered most, the men closest to the throne. One story, preserved in fragments, tells of how she first caught the notice of a rising figure within the court. Some said it was through performance, others through whispered encounters behind closed doors. What mattered was not the details, but the outcome. The girl who had once been dismissed as filth was suddenly standing within reach of the empire's most powerful circles. But the palace was not merely a place of glitter and jewels. It was a labyrinth of intrigue, betrayal, and cruelty, where every smile concealed a dagger. For most, entering its world meant destruction. Yet for her, the palace represented something else entirely: vindication. Every insult, every humiliation, every moment of degradation she had endured was leading her here. By the time she first crossed the threshold into the empire's inner sphere, she was no longer simply a performer, no longer a girl from the shadows. She was a figure of fascination, scandal, and fear. The aristocrats who once mocked her now whispered her name with unease. The priests who denounced her could not erase her influence. The city that had laughed at her was beginning to suspect that the laughter might one day fall silent. She was not yet empress. She was not yet untouchable, but the stage was set. And in a city that thrived on illusion, she was about to prove that the most dangerous weapon was not armies or faith, but the mastery of scandal itself. Because in Byzantium, power did not belong to the pure. It belonged to those who understood that shame, twisted into spectacle, could conquer thrones. And she was ready to begin her ascent. The palace of Constantinople was unlike anything she had ever seen. From the outside, it stood as a fortress of marble and gold, but within its walls stretched a labyrinth, designed not merely to house an emperor, but to dazzle, confuse, and control. There were endless corridors lined with mosaics of saints, chambers draped in silk, and gardens where fountains whispered secrets. Yet beneath its beauty, the palace was not a sanctuary. It was a den of predators. Those who walked its halls did, so masked in courtesy, but their smiles concealed daggers. Every servant carried whispers. Every eunuch knew more than he admitted. Every noble plotted against another, while pretending to bow in reverence. It was here, in this gilded labyrinth, that she was thrust. A woman already infamous, already despised, yet also impossible to ignore. Her arrival was scandal in itself. Courtiers sneered that a woman of her background had no place among the empire's most sacred halls. Priests condemned her presence as a defilement of holy ground. Aristocratic women gossiped behind jeweled veils, mocking her origins. But scandal, as always, was her weapon. For even as they whispered, they could not look away. Every insult they hurled at her only made her name echo louder across the marble corridors. The palace was a stage, and she understood better than anyone how to perform. Where others would have hidden in shame, she embraced her reputation. When nobles mocked her as unworthy, she dressed more boldly, her presence commanding attention at feasts and ceremonies. When priests condemned her shamelessness, she smiled, serenely, as though their fury were nothing more than background noise. By refusing to bend, she unsettled them. They could not comprehend how a woman branded by scandal could walk with the poise of a queen. But performance alone would not save her. The palace was a web of alliances and betrayals, and she needed more than notoriety to survive. She began to study the court as she once studied the taverns. Quietly, carefully, observing every gesture, every secret. She noticed which generals avoided the emperor's gaze, which eunuchs lingered too long at doors, which courtiers smiled as they poisoned their rivals with honeyed words. Most of all, she learned the emperor's weaknesses. He was not unlike the men she had known in taverns, powerful in name, yet ruled by desires he could not control. He loved spectacle, indulgence, the thrill of being surrounded by beauty and submission. And she, who had endured humiliation all her life, understood how to wield both beauty and submission like blades. She began to position herself not merely as a concubine, but as a confidant, offering him not only pleasure, but the intoxicating illusion of understanding. This was her first true step into danger. For the emperor's affection was a prize, but also a curse. Many before her had won his favor, only to be destroyed by jealous rivals. Yet she knew something they did not. Affection was fleeting, but secrets were eternal. And so she listened. She watched. She remembered. When generals whispered strategy in drunken arrogance, she committed their words to memory. When bishops muttered doubts about doctrine, she stored them away like coins. When eunuchs gossiped about rival courtiers, she turned their whispers into weapons. Slowly, she began weaving a web not of silk, but of information, a currency more valuable than gold in the palace of illusions. Her enemies, sensing her rise, struck first. Rumors spread of her corruption, her supposed witchcraft, her unholy influence over the emperor. Pamphlets appeared mocking her lineage, declaring her a threat to the very soul of Byzantium. Priests thundered from pulpits that the empire was doomed if a woman like her stood near the throne. Yet with every attempt to destroy her, they only strengthened her image. For scandal was not her downfall, it was her crown. Still, survival was never certain. At any moment, a rival faction could succeed in turning the emperor against her. A whisper in the wrong ear, a forged letter, a carefully staged trap could end her ascent in blood and shame. Every day in the palace was a game of masks, where one misstep could mean ruin. And yet, she thrived. The girl who had once been mocked in alleys now stood in chambers where emperors deliberated the fate of nations. The child once degraded for, her blood now held the ear of the most powerful man in Christendom. She was still surrounded by enemies, still despised by nobles and priests alike. But she had stepped fully into the lion's den. and the lions were beginning to realize that she too had claws. This was no longer survival. It was ascent, and though the palace was a labyrinth designed to destroy those who entered without noble blood, she was proving that scandal, weaponized with cunning, could open doors even the purest lineage could not. But the game was only beginning. For in Byzantium, power was never given. It was stolen, kept alive only by the strength to outlast betrayal, and soon she would learn that the same scandal that lifted her could also become the blade poised to cut her down. The palace of Byzantium was not a place of truth. It was a hall of mirrors, where every gesture, every word, every smile was a mask hiding something more dangerous, and she had learned through humiliation and survival to wear her mask better than anyone. In public, she appeared compliant, even demure, her head bowed before bishops and her eyes lowered before nobles. In private, she listened, calculated, and sharpened her influence like a dagger hidden beneath silk. To the emperor, she was the perfect companion, a woman who soothed his pride, flattered his strength, and indulged his vices. To his enemies, she was a threat too dangerous to name aloud, yet too alluring to dismiss. The court could not understand her resilience. They had seen countless women destroyed by scandal, chewed up by whispers and tossed aside by men once their beauty faded. Yet this woman did not fade. She grew stronger with every attempt to destroy her. When priests denounced her as sinful, she wrapped herself in displays of piety, attending services with a devotion that disarmed the public. When noble women mocked her as a courtesan, she appeared at ceremonies dressed in silks, finer than theirs, walking with the bearing of royalty. Every insult became another stone in the foundation of her power. What they failed to realize was that she had turned scandal into theatre. She understood that the empire did not truly care about morality. It cared about spectacle, and she gave it spectacle in abundance. The public who had once laughed at her now leaned in closer, fascinated by the audacity of a woman who refused to be destroyed. In a city addicted to stories, she had made herself the most compelling story of all. But she did more than perform. She began to maneuver. Whispers she gathered became weapons. A drunken general's admission of treachery became a rumor planted at the right ear. A bishop's secret indulgence turned into leverage when the emperor needed to silence church opposition. The eunuchs, who saw all and spoke little, found in her a patron who rewarded their loyalty with gold and favor. Slowly, the invisible web she wove tightened around the palace. She was no longer merely present, she was indispensable. Her enemies struck harder as her influence grew. Factions formed to drive her out, accusing her of poisoning the emperor's mind, of plotting against noble families, of corrupting the empire itself. More than once, plots were set in motion to exile her, to disgrace her, even to have her quietly removed. But each time, she turned the trap back on its makers. Evidence appeared at the right moment. Allies she had cultivated whispered at the right ears, and her enemies found themselves exposed instead. With each failed attempt, her aura of inevitability grew. She was no longer seen as an intruder who might be toppled, but as a force of nature that had to be endured. Fear began to mingle with hatred, and fear was always the stronger ally. Yet, the struggle was not without cost. To maintain her grip, she lived every day as though walking a tightrope over an abyss. A single misstep could mean ruin. Every smile she gave was calculated, every silence deliberate. She trusted no one fully, not even the emperor, for she knew his favor was as fickle as the tides. Her power was real, but it was also fragile, a flame burning brightly, but dangerously close to being extinguished. And still, she pressed forward, for she knew the truth of Byzantium. Purity was a lie, and power belonged not to the noble, but to the ruthless. By mastering the empire's own hypocrisy, by wearing masks better than any of her rivals, she had turned her greatest weakness into her sharpest weapon. By the time the whispers settled and the latest plots had failed, she was no longer merely a scandal. She was a necessity. The emperor leaned on her counsel. Courtiers sought her favor. Even bishops who had once thundered against her learned to temper their words. She had reshaped her place in the empire, not by denying her past, but by weaponizing it. The child of shadows had become the mistress of masks, and with the palace now orbiting around her influence, she stood poised for something far greater. The next act would not be survival, it would be transformation. For every performance, every mask, every whisper had been leading to the inevitable moment when scandal would give birth to sovereignty. And Byzantium would discover that its most dangerous weapon was not its armies, nor its emperors, but a woman who had learned to rule through fire and shame. Byzantium was a city that fed on whispers, but whispers, when sharpened enough, could become blades. And now, after years of intrigue, indulgence, and uneasy tolerance, the blades were being unsheathed. The storm against her began quietly, with murmurs in the marble corridors of the palace. Court ladies whispered that her power had grown unnatural, that she had bewitched the emperor with potions and charms. Priests, once silenced by her cunning, dared again to thunder from the pulpit that a harlot sat at the emperor's side, corrupting the soul of the empire. And the noble families, long resentful of her rise from scandal to influence, saw an opportunity to strike. The plot was simple in its brutality: unite every rival faction under one banner, the banner of purity against corruption. They painted her not merely as unworthy, but as dangerous, a poison at the heart of Byzantium that had to be cut out before the empire itself rotted. Meetings took place in candlelit chambers, far from prying eyes. Generals pledged their discontent. Bishops whispered of divine justice. Senators, drunk on their own self-righteousness, imagined themselves saviors of Rome's legacy. Some even spoke openly of exile, while others, bolder still, envisioned a quieter solution: a poisoned cup, a dagger in the night, a disappearance mourned by none. She, of course, knew. The palace was her theatre, and she knew every backstage passage, every actor rehearsing their treachery. The eunuchs whispered warnings. Servants slipped her fragments of overheard conversations. Her spies painted the full picture. The empire was aligning itself against her. For the first time in years, the ground beneath her feet seemed to tremble. She had always walked the tightrope of power, but now the rope shook violently, swaying over an abyss of ruin, and the emperor, he wavered. The man who had once leaned so heavily on her counsel began to recoil under the weight of constant accusations. Where once he had seen her as indispensable, he now saw the cost of her presence, the endless conflict, the unrest simmering across the city, the whispers even among his soldiers. In his chambers, his silences grew longer, his eyes colder. Once, when her hand touched his, he pulled away. That single gesture cut deeper than a blade. In that moment, she realized she stood alone. The emperor's favor was no longer assured, and without it, her enemies would consume her. The city itself seemed to turn hostile. Crowds that once gawked at her silks now jeered at her carriage. Pamphlets spread through the streets, condemning her as the downfall of Byzantium. In the Hagia Sophia, sermons turned into attacks, denouncing her by name, calling her a Jezebel, a second Eve leading the empire into sin. At night, shadows haunted her chambers. Servants she trusted vanished without explanation. Doors creaked where no one should have been. Even her food, once a source of luxury, became a potential weapon. She refused dishes, drank only from vessels. She guarded herself. Survival meant suspicion of everything, and everyone. Her enemies struck with precision. They demanded public trials, whispered to foreign envoys of instability in Constantinople, and pressed the emperor to cast her aside for the good of the empire. They were patient, relentless, and for the first time, she felt the walls of her fortress begin to close in. And yet, fear did not break her. It sharpened her. She did not weep. She did not beg. She did not retreat into silence. Instead, she listened. She measured. She calculated the storm, searching not for escape, but for the moment when the storm would exhaust itself and reveal its weakest point. But until that moment came, the danger was real. One wrong step, one misplaced word, and she would vanish into exile or into a grave marked only by whispers. The storm had broken. Her enemies believed they were on the verge of triumph, that the harlot empress would finally be struck down by the hand of morality, justice, and noble vengeance. What they did not yet realize was that storms, no matter how violent, could be redirected, and that the woman they sought to destroy had built her life not on calm skies, but on fire, scandal, and survival. The question was no longer whether the storm would consume her. It was whether she could bend it to her will and consume them. Instead, when storms break upon empires, they either leave ruins or reveal survivors who are forged harder than steel. Her enemies believed her cornered. They saw a woman abandoned by the emperor, despised by the people, condemned by the church. They imagined her nights sleepless, her spirit shattered, her power crumbling. But they had forgotten who she was, a woman who had risen not through virtue, but through survival. And survival demanded cunning sharper than any sword. The palace became her stage once again. While her enemies schemed in shadows, she dragged their shadows into the light. The first blow came with scandal. A senator who had denounced her most fiercely was suddenly exposed. His secret dealings with Persian envoys laid bare in letters that appeared mysteriously in the emperor's chambers. Another noble, who called her a corrupter, was caught in his own corruption, his wealth traced to stolen tax revenues. One by one, the pillars of the opposition cracked, each revealed to be rotten at the core. She did not confront them directly. Instead, she let the revelations unfold like a theater of humiliation. Courtiers whispered in shock, priests sputtered with fury, and the emperor, hesitant, uncertain, began to see that those calling for her downfall were guilty of far darker sins. Then came spectacle. She orchestrated processions, not of piety, but of power. Clad in garments brighter than the mosaics of Hagia Sophia, she appeared before the people not as a woman shamed, but as a queen untouchable. Her enemies expected her to cower. Instead, she dazzled, turning shame into theater, corruption into spectacle. The emperor, torn between love and fear, watched as she commanded the city itself. Where once the crowds jeered, now they marveled. Not all adored her, but all recognized her as inevitable. The priests redoubled their fury, but even their voices cracked when her agents unearthed their hypocrisy. Secret affairs, hoarded gold, alliances with her enemies. The sermons that once condemned her now seemed hollow, the men behind them disgraced. Her greatest coup, however, was reserved for the emperor himself. At the moment when he considered casting her aside to appease his nobles, she revealed what only she could. Documents, letters, proof that those closest to him plotted not merely against her, but against him. She forced him to see that abandoning her would not save him. It would destroy him. And so, cornered by truth and terror alike, the emperor chose her once more. Not out of love, not out of loyalty, but out of fear. With the emperor restored to her side, the purge began. Generals who had conspired against her were stripped of command. Senators were exiled. Bishops were silenced. Those who whispered of poison or daggers in the night disappeared into dungeons whose doors never opened again. The storm that had threatened to consume her was redirected. Her enemies, drunk on righteous fury, found themselves devoured by the very scandal and corruption they had sought to expose. By the end, the palace was silent. Those who remained bowed their heads when she passed, no longer merely the emperor's companion. She was the living embodiment of Byzantine power, dangerous, untouchable, eternal. The city had once whispered of her downfall. Now it whispered of her survival, of how a woman who rose from scandal became the empire's most feared figure. And though the empire itself remained fragile, though its enemies gathered at the borders, one truth had been burned into history. The storm had not destroyed her. The storm had crowned her. She emerged not as victim, nor even as victor, but as shadow made flesh, the dangerous empress who bent Byzantium to her will. By the time the palace settled into uneasy quiet, the empire was no longer the same. Byzantium, once a land of order and divine ritual, now lived under the reign of a shadow, a woman who had rewritten what it meant to hold power. Her enemies were gone. Some exiled, some disgraced, many simply vanished. Their families whispered of them in hushed voices, but no one dared speak openly. The city's grand avenues echoed not with rebellion, but with silence, the silence of fear. She was everywhere and nowhere at once. Officially, she remained only the emperor's consort, yet ministers knew their decrees passed only with her unseen approval. Soldiers swore loyalty to the throne, but their pay and appointments flowed through her hands. Priests spoke of virtue in public, but they bent their knees in private, their sermons sharpened by her invisible hand. The emperor himself had become a figurehead. To the people, he was still ruler of Byzantium. But behind closed doors, he moved, cautiously, like a man who sensed that every word, every decision, was watched by eyes that missed nothing. History tells us that empires are defined by their wars, their conquests, their monuments, but this chapter of Byzantium was defined by whispers. Whispers of scandal, whispers of terror, whispers of a woman whose survival had become more powerful than any sword or crown. Yet victory came at a price, for while she had outlasted her enemies, she could not outlast time. As the years passed, her beauty, once a weapon, faded, but her cunning only sharpened. The same nobles who once trembled before her began to comfort themselves with a dangerous thought. Surely she would not endure forever. And still she endured. Her name became legend even before her death. Children were warned not to cross her. Women secretly admired her strength, and men feared her like a phantom. She was both a scandal and a saint of survival. Proof that in an empire ruled by men, a woman could seize destiny with her bare hands. But here lies the cruel paradox, for in seizing her survival, she had poisoned the empire itself. Byzantium, once proud of its faith and traditions, now bore the scars of suspicion, betrayal, and corruption. Trust was shattered. Every noble, every priest, every general asked the same question in their hearts. If she could not be destroyed, who among us is safe? When she finally died, not by dagger, nor by poison, but by the slow hand of age, the empire exhaled, but it was not relief, it was dread. For the empire she left behind was weaker, more fractured, and more haunted than before. Her name was etched into the chronicles not as a victim, nor as a saint, but as something far more dangerous. A survivor who turned scandal into power, who turned enemies into ash, and who left Byzantium forever changed. Centuries later, historians still debate her. Was she a monster, a genius, a cautionary tale? Or was she simply the reflection of the empire itself? Beautiful on the surface, rotten underneath, yet impossible to kill. And so, the story of the dangerous empress endures. A woman who rose from whispers of scandal to rule an empire built on silence. A woman who proved that survival is sometimes the deadliest weapon of all. As the curtain falls on her reign, we are left with a question that still echoes through time. Was her triumph a victory for herself, or the beginning of Byzantium's ruin?